We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 11b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a brisa with a machlokas tanoim. Let's say you have a carbon shlamim, and you bring that carbon shlamim at the time of the carbon pesach, and you bring it l'shem carbon pesach, having in mind that it is a carbon pesach. So Rabbi Eliezer says that carbon is disqualified as psula, and Rabbi Yoshua says that it is kosher. And on the previous Amud, Rabbi Eliezer brings an argument. He says if we find that a moser shlamim, let's say you have leftover carbon shlamim, that is not allowed to be brought as carbon pesach, but moser carbon pesach, if you have leftover carbon pesach, that is allowed to be brought as a carbon shlamim. And so therefore, if moser pesach, which is allowed to be brought as carbon shlamim, but the halacha is that carbon pesach bismano, if you bring it as a carbon shlamim, it's puzzle. So moser shlamim, which cannot be brought as a carbon pesach, so for sure if you have a shlamim at the time of carbon pesach, and you bring that l'shem carbon pesach, that is going to be puzzle. And the Gemara continues, Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, the Brisa continues, Rabbi Yoshua says to him, he says to Rabbi Eliezer, Matzinu moser chatos ba'ola, we find that if you have leftover carbon chatos, it's brought as an ola. V'yein moser ola ba'chatos, but the leftover carbon ola is not brought as a chatos. And so let's make the following argument. U'machatos shemosara ba'ola, if by a carbon chatos, which it's leftover, can be brought as an ola. Shachta l'shem ola psula, and if you slaughter a chatos as an ola, it is puzzle. That's what we said in the Mishnah. It's completely disqualified. So ola she'ein mosara b'chatos, so you have an ola which cannot be brought. The leftover ola is not brought as a chatos. Shachta l'shem chatos eino din shetei psula. If you slaughter that as a chatos, shouldn't be completely disqualified, which is not true. So you see that your argument is leading to conclusions which are not true. And Rashi explains, Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Yoshua says to him, Matzinu moser chatos ba'ola, we find that leftover chatos can be brought as an ola. Kedetanya b'tmura, as we learned in a brayse in Tmura, Zem Medrash Dorash Yehoyada HaKohen, Yehoyada HaKohen darshaned as follows, Kol davar sheba mi moser chatos mi moser asham, anything that comes from leftover chatos or leftover asham, yilkach ben ola, l'ketz hamizbeach, you can purchase with that carbon ola for the kayetz hamizbeach, that's the summertime mizbeach. They wanted to ensure that they were always karbanos on the mizbeach in the summertime, that it was never batel. Vehechi dami moser chatos, and what would be an example of moser chatos, leftover chatos? Kagon hifrish mos lechatos. So let's say a person separated money for his carbon chatos v'nitosru, and then he had extra money. Inami or mafresh shtei chatos la'achrayas. Let's say he separated 2 chatos because he wanted to make sure that he had one to fulfill his obligation. Tekaimelon b'tmura, we've established in Tmura mischaper ba'achas mehen v'hashniya tira, that he uses one of them for atonement and the second one is left to graze. And then the Brisa said, U'machatos shemosarif, when it comes to a carbon chatos, where we say that the moser chatos is brought as an ola. V'im kal v'chomer kazeh tadorish, if you're going to make a kal v'chomer like that, yesh loch lifsol ola l'shem chatos, your conclusion is going to end up being that an ola brought as a chatos is puzzle, and so therefore you cannot make the limud, you can't make the kal v'chomer that you are making. And on the previous summer, there was a machlokas amoraim. What would Rabbi Eliezer say when you have a carbon that you bring l'shem chatos? Is that completely disqualified or not? Rabbi Yochanan said on the previous summer that Rabbi Eliezer would say it's totally disqualified, and Rabbi said no, only if you bring it l'shem carbon pesach bismano is it totally disqualified, but not if you bring it l'shem carbon chatos. And so Rashi now continues, from here, Rabba infers milsei la'el, what he said earlier. Midaloa hadr le Rabbi Eliezer anon nami pasilna binishchot and l'shem chatos, because here Rabbi Eliezer doesn't respond to Rabbi Yoshua that I actually agree with that conclusion. I say that if you slaughter l'shem chatos, it is in fact puzzle, and since Rabbi Eliezer does not respond that, it seems that Rabbi Eliezer actually holds that if you slaughter a regular carbon as a chatos, it still will be kosher. And the Brisa continues, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer says to him, he responds to Rabbi Yoshua, Lo imamrid bechatos sheken ksheira lishma kol hashana kula, when it comes to carbon chatos, which is kosher all year lishma, so over there we say again that if an ola is brought as a carbon chatos, it's going to remain kosher. But tomer bepesach, whereas by a carbon pesach, sheino kosher lishmo ela bizmano, that's only kosher lishmo at its time, and hoel vu pasel lishmo, they have a slightly different gears in the shinuye nuschos, it's hoel, since it is true that it's only kosher lishmo bizmano, so dinu sheyifsulu acherim lishmo, so it makes sense that if others are brought as a carbon pesach bizmano at the time of the carbon pesach, then in fact they would be disqualified. And again, you see from Rabbi Eliezer's response over here that by an ola that is brought as a chatos, it in fact is kosher. And again, taking a look at the Shinuye Nuschos, the proper girsa should be V'ein kosher l'shmo ela bizmano. Again, it should be Hoel V'ein kosher l'shmo ela bizmano, since that's true, that Korban Pesach is only kosher l'shmo bizmano, so it makes sense to say that it would disqualify others that are brought l'shmo at the time of the Korban Pesach. And the Gemara continues with the two dots. The Mishnah said, Shimon Achi Azariah Omer, Shimon the brother Azariah says that if a carbon is brought having in mind a carbon of a lower status, then it's disqualified. But if you have in mind a carbon of a higher status, then it is not disqualified. And the Gemara says, Ravashi Masni Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan, Ravashi taught in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ravacha Brei de Rava Masni Mishmei de Rabbi Yanai, and Ravacha the son of Rava taught in the name of Rabbi Yanai, my taima to Shimon Achi Azariah. What is the reason of Shimon the brother of Azariah? The Yomar Krutz, because the pasuk says, "V'lo yechalalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael es asher yorimu laHashem." It uses the phrase yorimu laHashem, and it means as follows: B'muram mehen. If it's something of a higher level of kedusha, ein mischalin. So then it doesn't profane the carbon, if that's what you have in mind. But b'namach mehem, something of a lower status of kedusha, mischalin. So then it is profaned. The Gemara asks, "V'hai lahachi u'da'asa," but is this pasuk really used to teach us this idea? V'hami boy leilach Shmuel, but isn't it needed for the teaching of Shmuel? The Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, "Minayin la'ochel es hatevel shu b'misa." From where do we know that if somebody eats tevel, which is produce, which you haven't separated trumas and maisrus, so then in such a situation the penalty is misa, the penalty is death? How do we know that? Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, "V'lo yechalalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael eis asher yorimu laHashem." So we understand that to mean ba'asidim litrom hakasa medaber. We're talking about produce which in the future you're going to take off truma, meaning to say we're talking about tevel. And so therefore you see again, if someone eats tevel, that the punishment, the penalty is misa. And the Gemara continues and answers, Imkain, if so, if all the pasuk was teaching us was the halach of Shimon Achi Azariah, that again, if you have in mind something of a higher level, it's kosher, something of a lower level, it's pasul, so then lichtov kra asher hurmu, then the pasuk could have just written asher hurmu, and we would have darshan b'mura mehen, again, ein mischalin, b'namach mehen mischalin, maya asher yorimu. Why does it say a future tense, asher yorimu? So shma minotarti, so we see both ideas. Yorimu, the future tense, tells us ba'asidim litrom, it's in the future truma will be taken off, meaning that it's referring to tevel. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Boy, Rabbi Zeira asks the following question: Kesherin ve'ein meratzin, in a situation where you have in mind, according to Shimon Achi Azariah, in a case where you have in mind something of a higher level, so he says kosher, does that mean that it's kosher but it does not fulfill the obligation of the owner? And in that case, that would agree with what the Tanna Kama says, because the Tanna Kama says in general, when you have karbanos that are brought shelo lishma, they do not fulfill the obligations of the owner. V'chi polig b'chada polig, and therefore the argument of Shimon Achi Azariah is really just in one case, in a situation where you have in mind something of a lower level. So Shimon Achi Azariah says it's completely disqualified, unlike the Tanna Kama, who says it's kosher, but it just doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. O Dilmar, maybe ksherin umeratzin, maybe if you have in mind something of a higher level of kedusha, it's kosher and it's completely kosher. It even fulfills the obligation of the owner of a tarti pligi, and then there'd actually be a double machlokas, because when you have something in mind of a higher level, it's completely kosher, and again, the Tanna Kama, the Mishnah just says it's kosher but doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. And when you have something in mind of a lower level, Shimon Achi Azariah says it's completely disqualified, and again, the Tanna Kama there says, like the middle track, the middle ground, that it's kosher but doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. Amar Abaye v'itema Rabbi Zreika. Abaye says, and some say Rabbi Zreika says, Tashma, come and hear the following proof. HaBechor v'hamaiser sheshachtan l'shem shlamim. One of the examples that the Mishnah gives is if you have Bechor and Meiser that are slaughtered as shlamim, so kasherim, so then that's going to be kosher, that's a higher level. And shlamim sheshachatan l'shem Bechor, if you have shlamim that's slaughtered as a Bechor or l'shem Meiser, or as Meiser, which is a lower level psul, and then it's disqualified. Now v'isal kadaitach kasherin umaratzina, if you think that the word kosher here means that it's also fulfills the obligation of the owner, but Bechor baritzuyehu, but Bechor is not even something that's fulfilling any obligation of the owner, so that wouldn't even make any sense in that context. So Ella rather, ksherin ve'ein meratzin, so therefore it seems that we're saying it's kosher, but not that it fulfills the obligation of the owner. Umidaseifa ksherin ve'ein meratzin, and if that's true at the end of the Mishnah, that it's kosher and not meratzah, so reishanami ksherin ve'ein meratzin, so in the beginning of the Mishnah also, we'll just assume that it's kosher when you bring it for a carbon of a higher level, but it's not going to be accepted, so to speak, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again, to satisfy the obligation of the owner. But the Gemara says, Midi area, do you really have to say that? Hakadisa v'hakadisa could be the Seifa is like it is, and the Reisha is different. In other words, at the end of the Mishnah where we're talking about Bechor, of course it simply means kosher, because that's all that's relevant by Bechor. But in the beginning of the Mishnah, when it's talking about general karbanos that are being offered, having in mind the carbon of a higher level, then maybe it's kosher, and it also fulfills the obligation of the owner. But the Gemara continues, but Ella mai kamashlan, but if that's the case, mai kamashlan, so what's that end of the Mishnah teaching us? Gavoa v'namuch kamashlan, it's teaching us this idea of higher and lower level, it's giving us an example. But Tanina, that we already learned in a Mishnah. Keitzad, how so? It says, Kadshe Kadshim, Sheshachatan L'Shem Kadshim Kalim v'chulu. The Mishnah goes on to say that if you have Kadshe Kadshim slaughtered as Kadshim Kalim, that's a lower level. Kadshim Kalim is Kadshe Kadshim, that's a higher level. It already gives us that example. What's the point of giving us the example with Bechor, with Shlamim and Bechor? And so the Gemara continues and answers, Ma'ud, what might you have said? Kadshe Kadshim v'Kadshim Kalim hu de'ika gavoa v'namuch. When you're talking about Kadshe Kadshim to Kadshim Kalim and vice versa, that's really a higher and lower level. Aval Kalim v'Kalim, but if you're going, let's say, from Shlamim to Bechor or Bechor to Shlamim, those are all Kadshim Kalim. So no, maybe I wouldn't apply this logic because I would say they're all the same level. But the Gemara says to that, Hanami Tanina, but that's also learned in a Mishnah later on. We already know that Shlamim versus Bechor, that's considered a higher level. Because it says in the Mishnah later on, Shlamim kodmim esa Bechor, mimnei sheyintunin, matan arbo, smicha, unesachim, utunufas chazav v'shok, that Shlamim come before Bechor because of all these extra requirements they have, like matan arba, the application of the four sides of the Mizbeach, and the leaning on the animal, and the libations, and the waving of the breast and the thigh. And the Gemara says to that, ha'ikr, this is the main place we learn that idea. Hahi agrara nasba, there it's just being brought along the way. And so really this is the main source of this idea that a Shlamim is a higher level than Bechor and Meiser Behema. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, HaPesach sheshachtu shachris ba'arba asr shalo lishmo. Let's say Karban Pesach is slaughtered in the morning of the 14th shalo lishmo. So this is not technically the Zman of the Karban Pesach, because that's really the afternoon of the 14th. So is this going to be a case which is going to be puzzle? It's going to be the same as the Zman of the Karban Pesach, or no, this is not the Zman of the Karban Pesach, and therefore it will not be puzzle. And so here Rabbi Yoshua machshir, Rabbi Yoshua says it's kosher, ki'ilu nishchat b'shlosh asr. That's the same as slaughtering on the 13th. It's not the time of the Karban Pesach. But Ben Beseira posel, Ben Beseira says it's puzzle, it's disqualified, ki'ilu nishchat ben arbaim, just as if it was slaughtered in the afternoon. This is considered its man in terms of this halacha being puzzle. And the Mishnah continues, Amar Shimon ben Azai, Shimon ben Azai said, Mekubal ani mipi shivim ushnayim zaken, I have a Kabbalah tradition from the 72 elders, biyom shehoshivu es Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah b'yeshiva, at the time that they installed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah as the head of the yeshiva, shekol hazvachim hanecholim, that all karbonos that are eaten, shenizbechu shalo lishman, if they're sacrificed, shalo lishman kasherin, they are kosher, ela shalo alu labayla misham chova, but they don't satisfy the obligation of the owner, chutz min hapesach u'min achatos, with the exception of Karban Pesach and Karban Chatos, by the Karban Pesach and Karban Chatos, they're totally disqualified. V'lo hosa ben Azai ela ha'ola, and all Ben Azai was adding was actually the Karban Ola, because the way it's phrased is the Zvachim hanecholim, the Zvachim that are eaten, the Karban Ola is not eaten, so that too would be totally disqualified if it was Shalo Lishmo. But the Mishnah says, V'lo hodu lo chachamim, the chachamim did not agree with Ben Azai. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Amar Rabbi Oshia, that Rabbi Oshia says, Machshir hoya ben Beseira bepesach sheshachtu shachris bi'arba asr lishmo, that Ben Beseira would say a Karban Pesach that's slaughtered in the morning of the 14th lishmo is actually kosher. Tekula yoma zimnehu, that the entire day is really considered the time of the Karban Pesach, meaning to say, it's not just that Ben Beseira says that if you slaughter shalo lishmo in the morning of the 14th, that it's puzzle. Again, we say Ben Beseira posel ki ilu nishchat ben harba. It's not just that he says that, but he actually says this is the Zman, the full Zman of the Karban Pesach, and therefore if you slaughter it the morning of the 14th as a Karban Pesach, it will be kosher. And the Gemara continues, Umay ki'ilu, if that's the case, why does he use the language of ki'ilu nishchat ben harbaim, as if it was slaughtered in the afternoon? That sounds like you're saying the afternoon is the main time to slaughter the Karban Pesach. And the Gemara says to that, Aidi damar Rabbi Yoshua ki'ilu, since Rabbi Yoshua in the Mishnah used the word ki'ilu, because he said it's as if it's slaughtered on the 13th, So therefore, Amar Ihunami Ki'ilu, so he used the same language of Ki'ilu, but really, again, Ben Beseira says the time for the Korban Pesach is the entire day of the 14th. The Gemara says, Yachi, if so, Adamiflagi b'shalol l'shmo, then why are they arguing in the shalol l'shmo case? Liflagu b'l'shmo, just be more straightforward. Argue in a situation of bringing Korban Pesach in the morning l'shmo, regular bringing of Korban Pesach on the morning of the 14th, and just have the argument there. And the Gemara says, Iflagu b'l'shmo, if they argued about l'shmo, havamina, then one might have thought, Aval b'shalol l'shmo, that in a case of b'shalol l'shmo, Modi Rabbi Yoshua ben Beseira, maybe Rabbi Yoshua would admit to Ben Beseira that by shalol l'shmo in the morning, that still would be considered the time of the Korban Pesach. For that, in respect to that halacha, it would be possible. Ho'elu miksaso roy, since part of the day is fit for the Korban Pesach. So kamash malon, so that's what it's teaching, that in this situation, again, Rabbi Yoshua would say kosher, where it's slaughtered shalol l'shmo in the morning of the 14th. He would not agree with Ben Beseira, who would say possible in that situation. The Gemara continues and asks, v'haksiv bein harbayim, but in general, how can Ben Beseira say the morning of the 14th is the time of the Korban Pesach? It says bein harbayim in the pasuk, which means the afternoon. Amar Ula b'reid Rav Eloi, Ula the son of Rav Eloi says bein shnei aravim. It really means between the two evenings, and so therefore it means essentially between the evening of the 14th and the evening of the 15th, and therefore it really means the whole day of the 14th. That's what it means. The Gemara continues and asks Talmud, well, if that's the case, if you can interpret bein harbayim meaning something other than the afternoon, so the Korban Talmud, the chsiv bein harbayim, by the Talmud bein harbayim, it says bein harbayim. Hachanami dekula yom kasher. Can you bring that the afternoon Talmud all day? The Gemara says to that, no, hasam over there, since it says that the first keves, the first lamb, is brought in the morning, that already implies that the term bein harbayim actually means the afternoon. The Gemara says, how do you know? Maybe one of them is brought in the morning, and one you have the whole day, morning or afternoon. And the Gemara says, Echad baboker v'lo shnayim baboker. No, we understand it to mean one is brought in the morning, and you do not bring two in the morning. And the Gemara continues and asks, Neiros, what about the candles of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, T'chsiv bein harbayim? It says that those are bein harbayim, they're lit in the afternoon. Hachanami dekula yom kasher. Can it be that you can light it the whole day? The Gemara says to that, Shani Hasam, it's different over there. T'chsiv mei erev v'ad boker. It says that they're going to be lit from evening till morning. V'tanyan, we learned in a brayso, mei erev v'ad boker. What does it mean from evening till morning? Tein lamidasi, you have to put in enough oil, enough of a measure, shetei dolekes v'olechas mei erev v'ad boker, that it can be lit from the evening to the morning, and so therefore you're going to light it in the afternoon, and it should be lit the entire night. That's the idea. Davarach, another explanation, ein lach avoda ksheira me'erev v'yad boker. There is no avoda that's kosher from the evening till the morning, ela zu belvad, except for this avoda. And Rashi explains, Ein loch avoda me avoda shein amuras b'yom. There's no avoda from the avodas that are done during the day. Kagon avodos hadam, like the avoda that you do with the blood, v'komso and the kemitza, u'ketoras and the ketoras, sheksherin mehadlakos neiros v'elach, that are kosher from lighting the candles and onward, shezu mucheres l'kulan, meaning this is the last thing you do. And so again, you see from that it's done late in the day. And the Gemara continues, Ketoras, with regards to the incense, T'chsiv ba, it's written over there, bein harbayim. It also says bein harbayim. Hachanami dekula yom kasher. They're also going to say the whole day is kosher. And the Gemara says, Shani Ketoras, the Ketoras is different. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph.